Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Go in, all right. 40 seconds, and then I'll be right back with you. Oh, we're ready to go? Oh, okay. That was a quick 40 seconds. Okay, I'm John Terr, president of the Boulder Chamber, and I welcome all of you to this panel discussion just for the purposes of making sure that the recording captures where and who we are. It's Friday, April 12th, and we are in UMC 235. And the title for this session of the Conference of World Affairs is, Does Capitalism Pay? Okay. Does capitalism pay? Now, I'm the president of the Boulder Chamber. I'm not going to offer an opinion, but you imagine where I come from on this. But I'm very excited to have a conversation with our panelists who come from a variety of backgrounds. And I'm just going to do a brief introduction of them and then just offer some just opening thoughts, and then give them a chance to then take it away with their remarks. So first of all, we have Leo Glaze, who is a teacher in LA. This is his second time here with the Conference of World Affairs, but he also does a number of podcasts. He is somebody who has been versed in DE&I activities. So welcome back, Leo. We have Rowena, who is a specialist in modern-day Chinese society, and in particular has a focus on the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement. So very interesting background. Then we have Rachel Sigma, who is with the Korbel School of Business at the University of Denver. She tells me she's going to start with some positive thoughts for this. Unusual for the Conference of World Affairs. And then we have Alexander Verbeek, who is from the Netherlands, is focused on climate issues, and in particular how they relate to security, which, as you can understand, security issues are more pressing as climate impacts start to press upon us. So to get our conversation going, I'm just going to offer just a couple of perspectives that are sort of the yin and yang of our thoughts on capitalism and how it plays out in society. And so as a proponent of capitalism, somebody might be familiar with the economist Milton Friedman. And he said, a society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. So equating capitalism with freedom. And then thinking about other positive elements of a capitalist society ties into, creates incentives for growth, fuels innovation, and like democracy, it's better than just about anything else that's out there, okay? So that's sort of the pro-capitalism perspective. A proponent of more of a equity position with respect to capitalism, John Maynard Keynes. And his quote is, "Capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone." Counterintuitive, right? And the concerns that are played out when you think about some of the more troubling elements of capitalism, monopolistic, easy for me to say, power, ignoring overall society needs, and then creating inequitable distribution of wealth. So these are things, probably common themes to everybody. So as we then play this out, let's be very interested to hear what the panelists' perspective is. And I thought, why don't we start right off Rachel, with your sort of more positive perspective on sort of where we stand as overall in society in a capitalist dominated environment.
Great. Well, thank you, John, for that introduction. Thanks to everybody for being here. Great turnout. As far as I know, is my last panel, so I just want to also say what a great time I've had the last few days and thank the organizers and the students and everybody for fostering such an amazing environment here. It's really been a tremendous experience. So I told John that I'd start off with some positive news. I would not go so far as to say I'm ready to attribute those positive developments to our capitalist system. So let me just caveat that. Okay, so part of the panel description asked, does capitalism pay, right? And what are its potential impacts on inequality, well-being, there were some other ones as well, poverty, these kinds of things. And so probably some of you are familiar with the website Our World in Data. They put together data from all different sources and look at sort of long-run trends on a variety of topics. So I was, in preparation for the panel, sort of reviewing some of the data that they present about these topics. And I was struck by some of what I saw. So for example, the share of the world's population living in extreme poverty, defined as less than $2.15 per day, has dropped from around 40% in 1990 to less than 10% in 2019. And that's a decline of from around 2 billion people living below the extreme poverty line to around 700 million. So 1.3 billion people taken out of extreme poverty. In 1900, the average life expectancy across the world was 32 years. And in 2021, it was 71 years. So we've seen basically a doubling of life expectancy since the beginning of the 20th century. Those improvements in life expectancy are happening at all ages. That means there's been a reduction in infant and child mortality, as well as older people living longer as well. We've seen incredible advances in medicines and vaccines and public health and living standards, and that has also contributed to the improvements in life expectancy, and drastic declines in things like polio and malaria and smallpox, really in a relatively short amount of time. In the field of education, the beginning of the 20th century, only 33% of the world's population had any basic formal education, and that number is up to 86.3% today. And literacy rates have had very similar correlated increases, where we have global literacy rates around 86% today. So anyway, that's some positive things are happening over the last century or so. And so then I think the question is, to what extent can these improvements be attributed? And by the way, I should say, there's also still many, many problems, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of discussion about those as well. So I'm not trying to erase anything, right? But I think it's kind of shedding light on some of the positive developments. So I think the question is, to what extent is the global capitalist system, can we attribute some of these successes to the global capitalist system, is sort of a question that this panel could address. And so, I don't know, I mean, we think about the societies, the countries in which a lot of these improvements have been driven or taken place. And I think to me, there's not any clear economic system that is necessarily at an advantage here, right? So certainly in countries like China or the Soviet Union, or elsewhere, we've seen drastic improvements in education and health and economic transformation and so forth. Likewise, in capitalist systems, we've seen improvements. We've seen, for example, perhaps the innovations that have driven the advancements in the health sector and in medicines. So it strikes me that maybe we're not asking the right question, right? Maybe it's not a matter of necessarily, is it capitalism versus socialism or some other system, but rather, sort of what are the more specific kind of human relationships or dimensions that have been able to give rise to some of these improvements across the world. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I love it. Great question. And if you're comfortable with it, we'll go down the line. And Leo, just thinking, reflecting, first of all, it's a beautiful sunny day, so maybe that's why Rachel wanted to start with the positive. But just thinking about your relationship with students, how do you communicate with them around these issues? But interested in what you have to offer.
I think the most impactful and simple statement that I can make is that poverty is not natural. And it is not caused by character or personal defects. It is something that is man-made and it is preventative. And I'll leave it there.
Wow. All right. Powerful. Powerful, Leo. I appreciate that. Now, I'd promised Rowena that she would go last, but you picked up the mic, so I'm ready to go with you. So,
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Good morning. It's so great to be here. I was looking in the room and I feel that I want to congratulate not just the organizers, but congratulate the town and the people. This is so beautiful, right? You put it together. I was thinking about, when I look at the topic, I feel like, oh, geez, I'm a historian, I'm not an economist. Do I have anything to contribute? But in the notes, they talk about, like, you can talk about the Chinese politics and society, and then you can talk about your most recent experience in Hong Kong. If any of you have been reading the news about my drama, right? I was recently banned as a social professor of history from Hong Kong because I studied the #1 taboo topic in China, the Tiananmen massacre. 35 years ago, actually, starting April 15. I'm sure many of you, like me, have great hair. You'll remember, not my students, for them is history. For us, is memory. I think every time I give a talk every week now in a different city, and people would be coming up and tell me, Rowena, in 1989, I was doing this. My son was born that year. I got my first job. So it's just like when Kennedy was being shot, and people would also tell you where they were when Tiananmen happened. Of course, I was a young girl, high school student in China when the government deployed over 200,000 army soldiers to the capital city of Beijing, and the PLA firing towards unarmed civilians under the gaze of the entire world. And yesterday, someone asked me, what is that? What's the difference between that and the Kent State? I said, well, you can talk about Kent State, you can be here, and you are not in jail. Look at me, right? If you don't want to tell the difference. So I am being banned from returning to my academic position, not because I'm a horrible teacher, not because I did not publish, right? I was the so-called top 5 book of the year when it came out. I got teaching awards. I taught at Harvard, I taught at Wellesley, I taught in Hong Kong, everywhere I got teaching award, still banned. And you can say that, oh, you talk about all those abstract things. But I want you to understand this is about humanity and human beings. I'm just like you, right? So I have my loved ones at home. I have my grandmother who died. I cannot go to her funeral. So things like that, the cost, the price like that, is not just say that, okay, capitalism or socialism in abstract sense. We are talking about human beings. And it makes so extraordinary when is Irvin in the audience? Who's the one who invited me? Maybe she's still trying to buy parking. She came to see me in the morning, and I said, oh really? Early morning breakfast before this thing. And she was telling me that, she's the one who invited me. And I said, if capitalism can make this happen, I said, who funded this conference? And she said, this has been running for a long time, for decades. And I said, if capitalism can bring us democracy, capitalism can bring this, then at least it's better than the socialism, because I've spent half of my life under socialism or under a country who condemned socialism. During the land reform, I'm a China historian, so during the land reform when the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, first came into power, they confiscated the lands from the landlords, right? And many of you probably know that part of the history. And the landlords were subject to mass killing, right? We are talking about millions of people were subject to massacre, right? Being killed after the CCP took control, and the land and the properties were distributed to the people, and of course eventually you saw in the the later part of the 30 years since the CCP came into power, they distributed this money and resources to their own people, right? So that the redistribution. So I can go into details later because I don't want to take up too much of the time. But a brief summary of how socialism and capitalism. But one thing I want to emphasize to my students all the time, when we talk about capitalism and socialism, we need to look at the nuances and complications. We can't just say, okay, capitalism and socialism and good and bad and that's it, right? We need to look at the evidence. Even when you talk about socialism, the Communist Party socialism, Canadian socialism, and European socialism are different, and capitalism as well. So I think this is particularly important when we come into any discussions, not just on this topic, but especially now, I think in this country. I was in Hong Kong teaching for 3 years. I came back, I feel I don't recognize the United States of America. People can talk to each other either on this side, on this side. If you try to tell them some facts and they would label you on, you're with us, no, you're not with us. I think that it's high time and important that we do what we are doing today. You don't just attack me, I don't just attack you, but we talk about and share our ideas. So we would go into much more details about socialism and communism or capitalism later. But one lesson I learned, not just a historian, but as a woman growing up in China, that in the name of ism, the dictators and authoritarian or those in power can do so many bad things. They can use that ism to get rid of the people they do not like, and they can use other isms to do things in the name of ism. That many things can actually happen, good or bad, starting from getting rid of capitalism and then the socialist reform. And then in the 1980s, the open reform policy, when they bring in the open reform economic market, and right after Tiananmen, the economic market economic came to a standstill. And then in 1992, in order to re-establish the legitimacy regime, Deng Xiaoping started this capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Whether it doesn't matter what ism you call it, as long as you can make money, then you can do. Right, so white cat or black cat, as long as you can catch the mice, that's the good cat, right? That's the slogan. So, and then you saw all these problems of so-called China rising with state capitalism combined with authoritarian rule. So money, yes. Ideas, no. As long as you don't touch politics, you can make money any way you like, and anyway, no bottom line. Exactly as they did in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. As long as I can maintain power, I can kill my people. So that's the message. That's the regime that you are dealing with, and that they export that mentalities and ideas and values in international trade in many of the issues when we are dealing with China this day. So I think that's the essence you understand. And in Hong Kong, under the British rule, they didn't have democracy, but they had freedom. And for a long time, there was academic freedom and thriving until the CCP took over, and until you probably saw the news a few years ago, and until I was teaching there 2022, until I was eventually banned just a few months ago. So I think that history matters, evidence matters. When we look at capitalism, socialism, it's important to look into the evidence. But we can go into more details later. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow. These are all powerful. I mean, I will say, so Alexander, just so interested too, for your perspective, given that climate impacts can be tied to maybe evidence of capitalism uncontrolled. So interested in your perspective.
Yeah, let's start with the question Ruina just raised of knowing where you were is, I believe, the night of 3 on 4 May 89, if I remember, when Tiananmen Square was crushed. I was at home in Utrecht listening day and night non-stop to the BBC World Service on live reporting, practically live reporting of what was happening there. It hit me maybe more than other people, because just briefly before, in February, I had been on that square practically daily waiting for my visa to enter what was then still the Soviet Union, because I took the Trans-Mongolian, better known as Trans-Siberian Railway, back to Europe after hanging out in Southeast Asia for like 9 months. So I saw the pictures on television of the same square where I'd been walking around not at all knowing what was happening, then traveling through the Soviet Union and through still communist Poland and still the existing DDR, the Eastern Europe, the communist Eastern Europe, on my way back to Utrecht to finish my studies. And looking back, that was a travel through the end of a huge part of the 20th century, because soon after, communism would collapse worldwide. And looking back at the 20th century, it has been for a large part, basically since about 1917 until 1989, it was a clash between those isms that Rowena just mentioned. 1917 when communism finally got a foothold, unexpectedly, not in an industrialized country as Marx had predicted, but it was in a still very much agricultural society, got a completely new kind of interpretation as Marx ever wanted. And soon after, you got the rise of fascism in several countries. Argentina was ahead of them, but it's mainly what we talk about, of course, Italy, and soon after Germany in the worst form. So it was, the Second World War is very much a clash between fascism and communism, although we from the West look very much more at we mainly look at D-Day and several other events. If you look at where the victims were, that is between those two isms. Now the main difference that I see between those two isms is that at least with communism you can claim that the original idea was a good one. It's a bit like what you do in a family. You share and share alike. You try to be equal. There's nothing wrong with that principle. The way it worked out, I think communism is responsible for somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people that died. No ism, whatever idea is behind it, good or bad, can be good if that's the price to be paid. Fascism started from day one with a very wrong idea that some people are better than others. And yes, fascism also cost us tens of millions of people that are dying. You can look up in the Guinness Book of Records which dictator has killed more people. It's a tight competition between fascism and capitalism. So in '89, all that collapsed. And that's when the famous, often misquoted and misinterpreted sentence of Fukuyama, the end of history, that our liberal markets, democracies, the capitalism in the form in democracy that as we know it in the West had won, that would be kind of definitive answer on how to do it. And yes, that was based on capitalism, but there's very different forms. Where I come from in the Netherlands, you could say it works like in a marketplace, but we have a lot of checks and balances to dampen it. You might say there are more social or socialist elements in it, but it is a functioning democracy, and we all vote for it, and we want it that way, and it works. Now, one way to look at what is successful is, and that's the question, does capitalism pay? There's a lot of ways you can look at it. I think one way to look at it is, well, how do you measure, does capitalism pay? I would say if the people in the country are happy with the system, then it pays. You can. It's not like, is Elon Musk getting richer than the guy already is? No, that's not the way capitalism should pay. It's the way it is paying, actually, because he earns, I think, per second what I earned in my lifetime or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's about happiness, that the people are happy, that you have good education, that you have all kinds of forms of security, that there's good healthcare available, that it's safe on the streets. And if you look at the World Happiness Index, the kind of countries that you find in the top 10 are very much, let's say, the Scandinavian kind of countries. So it is a marketplace, but there's a lot of checks and balances in place, and it's in a functioning democracy. For a long time, the democracies were always the countries with also the best economic system. And that seemed like a kind of winning system, because if you look in the history of mankind, it's not the one with the biggest armies that are winning in the long term, they win in the short term, but it's the best functioning economy and the best functioning society that wins in the long term. Now that has changed since Deng Xiaoping changed communism in China into a kind of, as even Rowena doesn't know what to name it, it's a kind of a capitalism under some kind of fake communism banner, basically meaning we are not at all democratic, but we bring in all these market elements. And economically, that has been very successful. Did it make people happier? Well, yes, about 400 million people that are lifted out of poverty in China, they will be happy to live in an apartment with a television instead of the horrible days of all the great leaps backward. But are they really happy with living in a situation where there's structurally no freedom? I believe Rowena is much more the expert to explain us why that is not the case. So does capitalism pay? There's a lot to say about it, and I don't want to talk too long now. But there's so many elements in it. I tend to say when the people are happy, that is the system that pays best. One last remark. What Leo started with, talking about poverty. If you combine poverty and happiness, this has been tested extensively. If you have nothing, you're not happy. But very soon, if you have a little bit, just the basics, you have a house, you have some healthcare security, you have some education, etc. You are at a kind of reasonable level. After that, if you then, earn the lottery and you get like 50 million or something, you don't become so much more happier. But so at the bottom end, it helps. What is the conclusion there? And there I'll stop. It means that it's a task for all of us to make sure that people are lifted out of poverty to that line where happiness starts. And there, the data that Rachel mentioned are of course encouraging, but still show that there's a lot that needs to be done. Thank you.
Beautiful. So, yeah. So just a little logistics point. So we are going to have time for audience questions. What we are going to have is some of our producers here are going to be walking around. Please write out your question, and then we'll get them up here, and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. But I wanted to start with the opportunity to see if our panelists had any response to some of the comments that were offered by your colleagues here. Leo?
I think one of the things that stuck out to me was Alex talking about, happiness and relative to poverty, and like certain countries in which seem to be doing capitalism and government a bit better than others. And the ones that we always kind of point to are like the Scandinavian countries, Norway and Sweden and Finland and places like that. It's also important to understand and know that part of the reason why those countries are more successful is because, honestly, they're more homogeneous than we are. Those countries are 97, 98, 99%, Norwegian or Finnish or Switzerland and things like Swiss. And so it makes it really easy to see yourself and your constituency and treat them with more humanity when they look like you. And that is a major part that is lacking in our government system today. It's the reason why those places have, free education for college and great health care, because the people there that pass those laws get to see themselves in everybody when they look out into that audience, every single day. And it's a part of the reason why we struggle as a group as well.
Hold on. Please, no outbursts. I wanted to, it looked like Rowena wanted to say something.
Okay, so this is so beautiful. Yes, Canada. I'm Canadian now. So that's why I said that there are different kinds of socialism. I grew up with material deprivation. When Alex was talking about China at that time, I didn't have anything, right? No hot water. My parents were sent away in the mountains after college, and I grew up without parents and in my early childhood, and there's no mother milk, so there's no money for milk powder, and I was a notorious crying baby because I was hungry. And then many of us were put in the daycare. The teachers told my grandma I was a retarded kid because I never talked to anybody. I was sitting the whole day without moving. So whether I was happier without money at that time, or later I have freedom. Like now, for the first time in the past, I would be so scared to talk to people openly with the video because I fear for my future, and now I'm being banned. It's like the other shoe has dropped. So it's hard to compare that material happiness and the liberty that you enjoy. That I think we are all human beings, right? So we want the basic things, and at the same time, I'm not an animal. And the CCP always told us we lifted people from property. That's why we did an extraordinary task. I think it's the Chinese people, they lifted themselves out of property. If it had not been for the CCP's policies all those years, especially during the Great Famine, right, ranging from 36 million people to 43 million people. So people argue at the academia how many, it is 36 million or 43 million, have starved to death during those 3 years. I don't care whether it's 36 or 43. The whole population of California starved to death under the regime within 3 years. So it doesn't really matter anymore. And at that time, it's not that China didn't have food. All the food was stored in the official depot, right? Why didn't you go and rob the official depot instead of going home and eat the body of your children, right? If you ever read any of the Great Famine book, especially the one by a Chinese senior journalist, that's someone I highly admire, right? Now the book Tombstone has been translated into so many languages. I remember when we were helping him with the New York Times op-ed, and the editors were telling us, don't talk about cannibalism, don't talk about eating your children, it's just too much for the Americans. And I was thinking like, okay, it's even too much for the Americans to read about it, but that's what we have been through. And this is a banned taboo historical topic. So, and that, at that time, China was under socialism. So I think we need to look at the absence instead of whatever ism, as I mentioned just now. And capitalism, of course, I'm not saying capitalism is not like democracy, the same thing. Like, it's not that you get married and you're happy ever after. You got capitalism, you got democracy, then it's perfect. The capitalism has lots of problems, right? And how we are going to deal with it in capitalism. So China has been through this first open economic, as Alice rightly pointed out, in the 80s. And after Tiananmen, they stopped that whole political reform. And starting in 1992, it's purely just state capitalism with authoritarianism. So state capitalism means if you don't play with me, if you're against the power, you are not going to be successful. You cannot be entrepreneur. You cannot be a businessman funded this kind of conference that's critical of a regime, for example, no matter how powerful you are, how rich you are. So that's why that wishful thinking for decades, people think that China is going to have democracy eventually with the emergence of middle classes. But if the middle classes, if the businessmen do not work with the regime, do not agree with the regime, it really doesn't matter who you are going to be ending up in jail or become losing everything. So I think it's impossible to talk about economic capitalism, socialism, without also talking about the political structure, the democracy, and as many of you have rightly pointed out, the context matters. Thank you.
Cool. Rowena, I'm loving everything that everybody's saying here, so I don't, no cutting off. Rachel, why don't you offer your comments?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to just pick up right on what Rowena was talking about. And I think a really useful frame that I sometimes think about is that which was advanced by the Nobel Prize winning Amartya Sen. And he talked about development as freedom, right? And that when we're thinking about how people, how people can become happier, as Alex would put it, or improve their lots in lives, or have a fulfilling life, he talked about the idea of capability development. And so you need both political and economic structures that enable people to develop their own capabilities. And so part of that is capital, right? It's money, it's resources. And part of that is freedom, to be able to choose one's path and so forth. And so for me, that's always been a very powerful sort of argument about how we think about these issues. The other thing I just wanted to react to, when Alex was talking about the sort of destruction wrought by fascism and by communism, I think we should not forget as well that capitalism was built on slavery and colonialism and many, many destructive processes. And we see those destructive and violent processes continue to play out in the militaristic forms of capitalism that we have in the United States and elsewhere, and the invasions abroad and so forth. And so I think we should just not lose sight of the potential destructiveness of capitalism as well. Thanks.
Great. Well, why don't I just kick it off with an audience question? And this, I'm going to summarize it, hopefully I accurately reflect it. But in essence, isn't it intrinsically a capitalist or capitalistic perspective to measure poverty and success via monetary terms? And what would be a more appropriate measure? So if it's assuming that we're sitting here talking about the benefits pro con of capitalism, and if you measure it in a intrinsically monetary fashion, is that really the way? And I think this gets to something Alexander was talking about with relative to happiness versus more essential monetary terms. Quick, please.
Well, often successes of countries are measured in GDP. Now, we're here in a country where about half of the population is suing the other half of the population for whatever, right? Something which in the Netherlands, I mean, I've never been involved in a lawsuit. I have to really think if I know a friend who has ever been in a lawsuit. I don't know. We deal with things differently. But if I sue somebody for whatever, saying something that I don't like, and then the other person sues me because whatever branch of a tree is coming in my backyard or the other way around, the GDP will increase because there's money going to lawyers, etc. And who's getting better? Who's getting happier from that? Who's getting better out of this? If you throw 1% of your population in jail, which is close to a world record, except for a few very tiny countries you don't want to think about, that is good for the GDP because your jails are mostly commercial institutions. There's actually an interest to keep these people in jail. It all adds up to your GDP. On the other hand, you take 1% of the population out of your workforce, then a lot of people come from other countries where they're no longer welcome. So there's all kind of other back that we talked about in some other debates. So measuring how successful you are in GDP, there's so much wrong with it. There's now this bill in Florida that I learned about this morning that not only is the word climate change no longer allowed to be mentioned in all kinds of government bills, but offshore wind energy is going to be forbidden, and the rules on all kinds of gas pipelines are going to be relaxed. So at the very place in the United States where you can daily experience climate change by the wet feet that you feel and by the wind, that is the place where they're going to take away they're no longer going to discuss about the reason for all of that, nor do they allow the solutions. Now, why is that? That is not because it makes the people more happy or safe. That is because of the absurd amount of influence that companies have on the running of your country. And you find that back in the elections as well. So that is, if that is the true form of capitalism, it is not the kind of system that I would prefer. I prefer a system where during the elections people really can vote on a wide range of different parties, being well informed about what is going on and where the money is being kept out of politics. So living partly in North America, living partly in Europe, I constantly keep comparing those two systems, and I have a clear preference. I won't tell you which part of the Atlantic Ocean. Thanks.
I think you hinted at it, Alexander. So any other comments on that question?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to capitalism, I mean, you only can, I guess, judge it by wealth. And this is difficult. I think we're up here talking about a lot of theories and things that are, complicated and have multi-levels to them. And I think we need to just make it simpler. Like, at the end of the day, we live in a country that prioritizes profits over people. And if we live in the richest country in the history of the world, it's not the fact that we, lack the ability to help people that we've now created, a system that is less favorable for them. It's the fact that we lack the will or the conviction or the want to. I would like to think that, looking at, across everybody that's here and, the probably average age here, I'd like to think that most of you all that are here are hopefully retired. And if you're not, there's something wrong with that. And that's not your fault. That is the society in which we live in. I'd also like to think that even for all of you all, when we're measuring success, whether it's monetarily or by happiness, I'd like to think that most of y'all in here are pretty happy. And it's also important to understand that, like, no matter how much money you all have, unless you owned your own business and you became a multimillionaire, chances are you all have been underpaid throughout the entirety of your entire career because you work for somebody that was more interested in making their own profit and trying to lowball you on your offers and on your salary than actually trying to give you a fair competitive wage that can make sure that you lived a pretty decent life. And knowing that part should piss all of you off. Because none of us want to be robbed. And I'm sure some of us have been, like literally, where you walk into your house, walk in your car, you see a window broken and your things are gone, and none of us smile and say, you know what, it's okay. But theft is never okay. And in a country in which, corporations are making record profit and making money hand over fist, and we're producing billionaires, the fact that, like, the federal minimum wage hasn't increased, the fact that, like, depending on, what county you live in, it's gone up marginally to the point where it's maybe $14, $15, $16 an hour, but nationally, in order to make a decent wage, you should be making $25, $26 an hour. Like, that should make us all pretty upset that part has not happened. And to me, like, those are the simple numbers that a lot of people that are less fortunate than maybe a lot of us in this room are the things that they are trying to struggle with and grapple with. A lot of people that are going to listen to this and a lot of people that are struggling don't understand what, gross national product is, and they can't explain it, and they've never seen it in a damn textbook, okay? But they do understand that when they look at all their bills coming in, that they don't have enough money to pay all their bills. And they do understand that when, they have to go ahead and go to that local county hospital, that they've got to wait, 5 hours in order to be seen because their health care is not that great. And those are the terms that I would like to speak in, and the terms that, like, would reach the people that we are, theorizing and talking about. Because for a lot of us in this room, we are pretty fortunate, we are pretty safe. I would like to think that I'm underpaid, and even still, like, I make a decent enough living to support me and the people around me that I care and love. And at the end of the day, I know that there are a lot of people out there, some of you in this audience, and people that look like me, that don't necessarily have that same ability. And so when we think about government structures, we think about policy, we think about money and economics, like, I would like to talk in terms that could make the people that are most affected by our capitalist society speak in terms in which they can understand and grapple with and think about.
Just so amazing. All right, yeah, did you want to say something, Rowena? Yeah, please do.
So thank you. I hope I'm not taking too much of your time. So I can give you an example of the Chinese capitalism without the sense of equality and taking care of others, right? So the most hot topic these days in China is the left behind children. How many of you know the left behind children? Because in China, we copied the Soviet Union system of the household system. So it doesn't matter where your parents go to, your kids cannot go to you without a household registration in that city. For example, you live in Colorado. Now you want to move to Texas. Your kids cannot go with you because you don't have the household registration. So that's what we mean by left behind children. So the parents have to go to the cities to work in the factories for capitalism, for money, whatever, to make the chips, the SIM cards for you guys, and then the kids would be left at home. This has been happening for decades, right? So left behind children have become a huge problem. And recently, because a brutal killing of some young kids killing other kids in school, and then the government saying that, okay, we need to lower down the age for punishment to punish these kids, because nowadays we have so many kids killing the other kids, right? So, but that's not a solution. The solution is to let the kids go to school with their parents, to move when their parents cannot live in the villages and the countryside, they move to the city to work in factories, and then they can go with them, then they can have their parents and things like that. So, but the left behind children has become such a huge problem in the name of like prosperity and China rising. So they exploit these people, and their parents were working in the cities, and then now the kids were left behind. So that's one example. Capitalism without equality and all these ideas protecting the weak of the society, right? So in history, socialism without democracy, the famine that I mentioned to you, I role play this all the time with my students. If you are starving today, what are you going to do? You go home and cook. But there's no way you can cook because all the cooks were taken away during the Great Leap Forward. They said, eat at the commune. It's collective, right? If you ever dare to hide some food in your house, you will be in huge trouble. You'll be class struggle, and you'll be massacred, killed, right? So then, okay, you cannot go home to cook. What else will you do? My students say, okay, I'll text I'll social media my friend and bring me some food, right? In those days, writing letters. The letters would be confiscated right away, and again, you will be beaten up, you will be class struggle. So you cannot do that. And then run away, right? If you ever read the Great Famine book, right? Or the Tombstone book, there were so many bodies along the railway, right? And then if you ever dare to run away in the buses, then they would just take you and class struggle. So ruled with fear, ruled by fear, without democracy, you actually literally, even though there were tons of food, China was exporting food when all these people were dying in the country. It's again, 36 million. I'm not talking about 1, 2, 3. So that's why without democracy, whatever socialism that they talk about, they were telling you, and the fear that people did not dare to say, we are hungry, we are starving. Instead, every day, the newspaper, the People's Daily was celebrating. So this town was dying, everybody is dying, and they said this town has the best, harvest of the country, and they're doing great. So that kind of lie has actually cost so many people's lives. So whatever ism, look at the evidence and have a mechanism to protect the people. That's very important.
Well, let me build off this. And there was a question, and I just want to apologize up front. There's so many great questions. We're not going to get to all of them unless we stay till 5, which I'm glad to do, but I'm not
I'll
known
stay
for
till
panelists.
5 also.
So this was a question that came in about sort of the notion of a stable functioning democracy has been beneficial to a positive capitalist environment, also though sharing more of the benefits. So why does it seem that so many who are supporting of capitalism move to more of a fascist or seem to find appeal in a more fascist society? Do people? Yeah, well, I'm looking at anybody. I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, it's as we see the benefits of capitalism, some benefits. There seems to be, though, some more trends towards authoritarian government structures.
Well, I think the problem why none of the 4 of us is answering is that all 4 of us don't seem to be the kind of people that are very much attracted to fascism or communism or all kinds of other isms. It puzzles me. I can't give you the answer, but you see a trend towards fascism in many countries in the West. Or maybe it's better to say a trend towards populism. I'm puzzled what the roots are, but maybe a few of the pieces of the puzzle in understanding it is that maybe there's a a fear among people that the society as they knew it is changing. And therefore you find with all these populists always the element of going back. The word again in MAGA is a trigger. But you find it in all those leaders in Europe as well. You know, France is no longer safe. Those kind of things. One quote I used recently by Marine Le Pen. So it's you also see it in the Brexit movement in the UK, for instance. We go back to the days when it was the England, the UK as we knew it. And now rapidly things are changing. Suddenly you see in your neighborhood people that look different than you and your family, or that maybe cook different and it smells differently, or the climate is changing, and somehow you feel that this is going to be a big thing that's going to impact everything, and it's really scary. And one of the ways to prevent yourself against something like, to protect yourself against something like climate change, is just denying that the thing exists. So then the threat is not real. So then you support those people that say that climate change is a lie, or that scientists don't agree or anything, because it's kind of a safe hole to stick to. So this kind of returning back, which is always an element in fascism. I mean, look at Mussolini with the fascists and going back to the Roman times, or look at this completely fake history that Nazi Germany had on some kind of made-up image of the Germanic tribes, etc., actually based on a description by the Romans that had a reason to describe it that way. Anyway, that's how Himmler interpreted it and sold it to all the other leaders in fascism. So I think those are elements in there. I think there's an element of fear, and you see that the leaders of the fascist movements or in the populist movements, that they play on this element of fear. You see that, just to name one example of one of those would-be modern fascists, Donald Trump, that he is using this now that your representatives in Washington were ready to accept new measurements on new laws on immigration, which were bipartisan agreed, that then the instruction from Donald Trump came not to accept those, because otherwise he couldn't campaign on the feelings against migration and against people that look differently than the average people in North America. Those elements you find back everywhere. So I think that is a rapidly changing society is a fertile ground for populism and deep-rooted feelings of fear that people have. Maybe those are a few elements of the puzzle, but again, since I'm not a fascist, I'm not very good at explaining the concept. Thanks.
It's not your choice, I guess. Rachel, did you want to offer some comments?
Yeah, I wanted to just note a couple of things. I guess I see sort of three kind of interrelated things happening that maybe create this dynamic. So first, I think changes in technology are really important, and the way that mediates our citizens' relationship to leaders and vice versa, and the way that it potentially empowers, to a greater extent than before, the wealthy elite, right? The second would be, and this is related again, the concentration of economic power under capitalism. So the nature of capitalism is that the capitalists want to keep accumulating more and more and more, and then they want to do away with the competition, right? And so we see this, for example, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. You go from having, you go from having a larger banking sector to a much more sort of concentrated banking sector. And we see this, of course, in many other areas of the economy as well. So you have a concentration of economic power, which oftentimes means that those capitalist elites are able to consolidate political power as well. And then the final thing I'd say is just the sort of the crisis of confidence in our institutions to be able to address all the complex issues that arise surrounding technological change, inequality, pandemic, climate change, you name it, right? And so the sort of the concern, I think, and this is especially palpable among my undergraduates who I see in class, they really have no assurance whatsoever that democratic institutions can address these challenges. I think, probably, what Rowena would probably help convey is that it's not clear that authoritarian institutions can address these challenges either. But I think, sort of this interplay of these different processes creates a very fragile moment in which somebody who comes along, claims to be very strong and that they can solve these problems is very attractive to many people.
So. Leo, did you want to offer some comments on this?
I think that when it comes to the idea of fascism, I think one of the reasons why we see a high propensity of it now is in order to squash dissent. I think that, political figures can look out to, their populace and see that people are unhappy and are starting to voice their opinions more and more. And so, I guess regressing into the idea of fascism also brings back that idea of law and order and keeping people on their spot and keeping people in their place. It also keeps people as workers and just day laborers. It's not a coincidence that, there's been a 50% increase in child labor violations since 2023. That we are now in an area in which many states are okay with, having kids work as young as 13 or 14 years old, operating heavy machinery. And then when they get caught doing this, like a lot of these businesses, they get to pay a fine, but nobody's serving any jail time while these kids are being maimed or hurt. And then you've also seen, the idea from a lot of politicians that we've unfortunately elected that have decided that, the age of retirement shouldn't be 65. It should be 68. It should be 70. So in essence, what they're telling us is that we should just go ahead and work our entire lives to, maybe scrape away, put away a few pennies. And by the time you retire at 70, our, average age of living is going to be 74 for men and 77 for women. And we get a couple of years of independence and, I guess, relative autonomy by ourselves before we pass on, and the next generation is doing the exact same thing. And so for people that, for these politicians that want to sort of regress into fascism, it's all about control. And if they can get us to go ahead and turn us into workers from 14 to 70, while they continuously make money off of us and allow, lobbyists to make money on their behalf, then they're more than willing to do that if it gets us just working and not complaining.
Sure. Rowena, please.
I'll try to be quick. So 2 points. I follow up with Rachel and Alex. I fully agree. I share the concern for populism and also nationalism globally, not just in the United States. It really scares me when people now on both sides, they radicalize and brutalize each other. And as leaders in the leadership, they feel that if I say all this superficial political correctness either way, then I will get the support of the people easily right away. That kind of cause of nationalism and populism, I think that it was going to cause us very dangerous things, including war. History tends to repeat itself, so that's something. I think that we need to have informed, responsible citizens, and don't just ask what the leadership can do for us, but also I think each of us now has the responsibility to help each other to be informed, be responsible before you really strongly just be radical and out there and say something loud and under the circumstances. Democratic mechanism to ensure that people would have access to free information, to become informed citizens, and would not punish critical thinkers. That's even more important than ever. So number one. Second, about measurable of capitalism or socialism, what's good, what's bad. I think that's why we have the different methods of quantitative research methods and quantitative research methods. I think both are important. Yes, China has become the world's most powerful economic power, right? Surpassing the United States, surpassing Japan. But look at what's happening in the country, right? Everything, whether people were happy and the crackdown on dissent and the environmental issues and the children that I now talk about, and course, for many years, the one-child policy, women can't even say that I want to have child and not having child, right? So forced abortion and sterilization. So you hear all these stories all the time. So I think that it's important to keep this, again, evidence in mind when we look into the isms and don't just let whoever in the leadership to manipulate us and tell you that I can do this if we could this and that. And one thing I always remind myself is don't become the enemy I'm against. If I'm critical of this whatever, I need to make sure that I do not do the same way to win them. Like, that's why even if the Chinese students sometimes, because they have been confined in certain narratives, and they think people like me are traitors because I'm critical of government, that means I'm critical of China. But I still do not want to shut them up. I still want to engage them because I believe in dialogue and engagement. And this is the only way that we can change the world instead of shutting them down. Thank you.
So considering just a more global perspective and the challenges we face, climate change, global war, civil unrest, poverty, what role does capitalism or capital society like the United States have in addressing those challenges? Or should it play in addressing those challenges?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, I know. Well, that's essentially the question is, if we see these global challenges that maybe we're somewhat insulated at times from, or can have more capacity to address, what role does a capitalist society in its own interest have in addressing these global challenges?
Well, if you look at global challenges, like let's take climate change as one that's nowadays relatively easy to imagine because you see it happening in real time now. Not one country in the world has got everything right on climate change, which shows what a wicked problem it is. Starting with the fact that you can always point at another country that is more guilty than you are, since there's not one country in the world that produces more than 50% of the problem. Although you get close, you got about a quarter here. So does capitalism, let's start with the cause. Capitalism caused, you could say, part of climate change because companies were not checked enough by the governments. Companies knew, the oil and gas companies knew better than anybody else, including the scientists at universities. They had the best scientists in the world. They knew that they were polluting this planet in a way that it would heat up like a greenhouse, which would kill millions and millions of people. And instead of warning us, taking action and changing their policies, they decided to keep it secret, but invest money in systems to create confusion. You all remember the lines, the scientists don't agree yet. They did agree, because it's easy. This is 19th century knowledge, as I said before in another panel. So, unbridled, unchecked capitalism doesn't make the people happy. On the other hand, the other alternatives I mentioned earlier, the ones that we tried in the 20th century, were even causing more misery. So what works? I think the marketplace has a lot of potential to regulate itself, but not enough. So in a time of more global challenges and of more interconnectedness in the world between countries, what you need is more governance and not less. And where this country somewhere went on another track than we did in Western Europe was in the days of Ronald Reagan, where he said that the government's not solving your problems, the government is the cause of the problems. And that combined with an idea of trickle-down economies, I never understood it. It seems like all of you should now transfer $100,000 to me and I will make sure that you will get happy. Well, I'd love to try it here, but I can assure you it's not happening because I'm going to enjoy all that money. And actually, if I would be a company, instead of sharing those profits at the top with the people that actually made it happen, I would use as a company that to buy back my own shares so that the shareholders, the already rich people, get even more rich instead of the people that actually produce everything and the workers that are in there. Well, I would also, as a big rich company, I would then spend that money to pay politicians, first of all, to make sure that there are something like Citizens United, and you can do that with all the power you have as a company, that is accepted so that companies even get more power to influence politics. And then I would make sure that everything is put in place, that the restraints on capitalism that are so needed to make a happy, healthy, prospering society, that those are released so that I can even get more rich. And that is exactly what this combination of a kind of dislike of governance with a trickle-down economy, what that has created. Now you finally have a president, the first one since the period between 1933 and the end of the Carter administration. You have, for the first time, a government that wants to change it, that is actively trying to invest the money not on the top, but among the working people that really need it. And it is highly successful. You have such a wonderful president at the moment. Look at what he has achieved. Look at the job growth. Look at where the money is going. Unfortunately, 4 years is not enough to really convince the people of those numbers. And that combined with all the money that is going into misinformation, disinformation in this country, some of it even coming from other countries, to disinform you on what is really happening in this country. And now a lot of people in this country are voting for a president who basically puts online his ideas that he wants more money to the top, and who in his previous tenure showed exactly that was basically the only thing he achieved was making sure that the people at the top got more money and the people who voted for him got less money. And that is a puzzling situation, because the essence of democracy is that altogether you decide on policies that are good for all of you. And if he says the system is broken, I say, yeah, you're right, the system is broken, because the people, a lot of people are so confused now that they're not voting what is in their own interest. So capitalism works when you bring in checks and balances in a properly functioning democracy. I think that is, from experience so far, the best system we can have. But it's a fragile system. And the fragility of that system is now more visible than ever before in the years since the big changes of 1989. And this is a very, very dangerous moment, not only in the history of the United States, but in the history of the world. Because if the people of the US, no, if the outcome of the election, that is a better formulation because that's not equal in this country, if the outcome of the next election means that Donald Trump will be elected and he is going to do everything that he has said that he is going to do, my conclusion is that that is the end of a well-functioning democracy. There were just elections in Russia too. You will have elections. But will they be free and fair? I highly doubt it. And that may impact the future of the world on a global scale if that happens. So that's my view. Thanks.
All right. I'm going to ask, I know Rachel and Leo are chomping at the bit on this one. Powerful statements. Rachel?
Well, why doesn't Leo go first?
Okay, please.
You know, I could argue that one of the things that we have not necessarily talked about when we talk about capitalism, we have not done a good job of talking about the history of this country when it comes to enslavement. Black people in this country are the original capital in the word capitalism. And so when we think about this idea of capitalism working and we have these ideas of how it can work, Capitalism can only work if everybody's playing on an actual level and even playing field, and they are not. None of us are. You know, what a lot of people would like is to go ahead and forget, you know, the 2 centuries of enslavement and the 100 years of Jim Crow laws and, you know, the school to prison pipeline and the prison industrial complex, and just start everybody off from even right now, except for the fact that they're not. Some people have started off with a monumental head start. And in this case, like, nobody's ever going to catch up. This is not going to be even. And trust me, like, our democracy doesn't come down to one election or not. And I can make the argument that we're not even a democracy, because most of us agree in basic health care, most of us agree in a woman's right to choose, most of us agree in sensible gun laws, and yet and still we don't get that because our elected officials do not vote for that stuff because they'd rather have their pockets lined. I'd also say that when it comes to, you know, the great job that we think that Joe Biden has done about bringing jobs in and the job growth, you know, last year we saw a 12% increase in homelessness. Those people wouldn't necessarily agree. And a lot of the jobs that Joe Biden's taking credit for creating are jobs that were lost during the pandemic, which our country failed at horribly. And so when it comes to that, and not to mention a lot of those jobs were lost not because, you know, companies couldn't afford it, but because people literally died. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And now he gets to go ahead and take credit for recreating and bringing those jobs back. To me, that just doesn't really necessarily make a whole bit of difference to a lot of people out there that are struggling every single day. I'll leave it at that. And I guess the original question would have been, who's to blame, or what role does capitalism play in, you know, helping this world? It plays all of it. Capitalism is what's made, you know, global, you know, the global warming crisis that we have today. And so, like, if you're going to make that problem, then you should go ahead and take care of it. And while you're also actually taking care of it, don't take credit for putting out a fire that you started.
Did you?
Yeah, just real briefly, I was gonna pick up on a lot of those same themes. I think capitalist societies have a responsibility for reconciliation and accountability for past injustices, absolutely. There needs to be assurance that corporations, or some mechanism through which externalities, environmental, social, economic, political, are built into this, are addressed in the system, whether or not that's through the price mechanism or through governance or through whatever. There needs to be clear sort of ways of doing that. And then the third thing is just a robust social safety net, because no matter what system you have, you're going to have winners and you're going to have losers, and you need mechanisms to take care of those people. So.
All right, well, that's really helpful to end. Yes, absolutely. So ending this conversation on a forward-looking perspective, really helpful. And we could have talked through this issue for quite some more time, but I really appreciate the commentary. Alexander, Rowena, Leo, and Rachel, thank you so much for your perspectives. Yeah.